and good evening. It is February 26th, 2025, and welcome to another edition of Coffee and Donuts. As you know, we created this section of the Dusty Feet to chat about various topics. Many of the folks that I know, they often hear me say, right, here's something to ponder, that's something we want to talk about, and we're probably going to need coffee and donuts to talk about it. So let's continue our discussion on context, the context of the stories in Scripture. Does that really even matter? Does that actually affect my views of this wonderful collection of scrolls and letters that we call our Bible? So, let's grab some coffee and donuts, engage with context, part 3, on the Dusty Feet. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at The Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Belief understandings may be challenged. Divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. Oh, of course, and before I forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. But the reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because it is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So about context, when I began exploring this topic, I thought it was just going to be a short episode where I'd bring it out as something even worth exploring. But the more I got into it, the more I realized it was going to take a little bit more to explore a little bit more, to connect the dots. Developed into an episode. I didn't want to be too long, so I decided to break it into smaller sections. So this is our part 3. And hopefully it will, for lack of a better term, connect in context. So for clarity, let me say this up front. By context, I mean that these stories, they're not isolated, right? They are not in a vacuum. These are about living, breathing people like you and me. They've had a life before we got them in the story. And even in their lives, we get literal minutes of a lifetime. At best, we get a third person for the vast majority of the story anyways. But I think context is stopping to take into account that this is only a scene in their whole setting of life, right? Because at times we need to stop. Consider this setting, this scene in the wider picture it's in, and maybe how someone might respond during that scene, in that setting. And then maybe we might end up even trying on a pair of sandals or two. Context. The garden. 2 people living a life of care, love, peace. One might even use the word content, or at least maybe we think it should have been. I think we start to drift into a gray area there, even with that word. But they're living in a garden. No real care in the world. As if they're, in the story anyways, no worries. Then you get into this gray area of context where they're deciding to play the game, right? And by game, I mean life. They want to do it their way. We choose the fruit. And of course, they're expelled from the garden. how do you think those two people are in relation to each other now? How might they be engaged in their interpersonal lives, right? The lives of their yet to be born children. And how might they be living life at that moment? And then in those choices, how does that affect Abel, Cain, Seth? Context, I think, is crucial. When you read the words of the man and the woman after those times, you really pause to consider what they might be feeling. Because I think, to be fair, it is very much worth your time, right, to look into the Hebrew words, look into the word repetition, look into the word choices. I think you'll find that context most interesting. Context. Noah. The world is in turmoil. It's in disarray. It's spiraling out of control. And then God asks this man and his family to build a boat, right? And in that, we will have a life eradicating event, right? In today's world, we might call this an extinction event, right? As in meteors hitting the earth and the devastation that follows basically eradicates life. Because this family, it gets off a boat after very much more than 40 days. And when they step out, all they see, well, it's utter devastation. The world has been laid waste, right? They're nowhere near home. All life is in their boat. Fish excluded, of course, but yes, there was a rainbow. But I think it's only looking back that when we make this statement that the disarray maybe was wiped away, but there's a lot more to follow on that. But there's nothing. This family will start as the only ones with the reminders of the event all around them for the entirety of their lives. You might even say the entirety of their children's lives, right? So I'm not sure an event like that, with all those signs of that catastrophe, that they would just disappear quickly. Those reminders, they could haunt you. I know when I drive through parts of South Carolina and Georgia, where I live, and I see lingering reminders of hurricanes past, multiple hurricanes. And then when I see that, is we see what we see, and then how that affected the lives of the people around. And then when you read this story, and this man and his family afterwards, then maybe that context lens might give you a different way to approach how you view these people, how they're acting in the story, the grace you might want to give them. Context. Children of Israel. Okay, so they've lived in this land their whole lives, right? They've been told stories about their forefathers, how you came into this land, and yet the life you're living is not the life in those stories. This life now is filled with oppression. You're told things. You might hear stories about promises. I'm not really sure, seeing what they see, that, at least in their view, that God is ready to fulfill those promises, because everything around them contradicts that. And then, in your lifetime, a man comes along who you've probably never heard of. This man, who was miraculously pulled from the River Nile 80 years ago, was raised by an Egyptian family, led a very different life from the one you're experiencing now, and if you might have heard the story later on, it's been 40 years since he disappeared. So I'm not really sure the average person is going to know about this guy, much less embrace him. He shows up. He echoes promises. He speaks of miraculous things. And then you experience devastation beyond your wildest dreams. You see it. You see that devastation. You see its result. The devastation is a thing of nightmares, pestilence, sickness, ruination, and in the end, death. And this is the lens, the context lens that you will, in that moment, at that time, then view this God that you're not so familiar with, that you've maybe only heard stories about, and this is all you've seen of him. At least all you've seen is this power of God. So what lens are you viewing this God through? Is this a God that you're going to see and you're going to feel that he cares, that he loves, that he has concern, right? Does the story's context give you any reason to look at them and ask, why didn't you get that? This was a loving God who wanted to care for them, but it's much less of a surprise, really, when you read the stories as their journey unfolded in the context that they were in. Context. Daniel. You're living in a land where you've been carried off. You've become human spoil to the conqueror. Told the stories of old. You've heard about men talk across the land. Their stories were shared. They're telling people to change, to get back to the way of this God. And that's part of their history. And these men tell you that devastation will come and you will be carried off. So now, you're carried off to foreign land. Those that are carried off are the cream of the crop, right? The brightest, the boldest, the prettiest, the strongest. These are commodities to be traded as they spread throughout other lands. And you, Daniel, you end up in the household of a ruler of an empire. But you listen to that man, that prophet of God. You understand what he's telling you. You know what's going to happen, but you still choose to embrace the ways of this God. You believe in what he tells you. No matter where you live, you're going to live in the honor of that God, even if it'll cost you your life honoring him and they attempt to kill you. This didn't work. So then you write what you write. You write about the things you've seen, the things you've experienced. Then you read the text of Daniel. This Daniel, he never went back to the land. He never went back to the land that he was born. It's postulated that Daniel lived 90 or more years, and he served multiple rulers over a very long period. And I just wonder, when we take that into account, how we might see his story in context. Context. It's been over 400 years since you've heard a prophet declare the coming of God, at least what we've heard in the scrolls about, the ones that the people that they would see that would make such a claim. I guess, to be fair, in that context, it's often viewed backwards that they were a viable prophet of God because what they said about God or for God came to be, right? Versus a person who said they were a prophet and then what they claimed didn't happen or wasn't from God. So you really wouldn't call them prophet, would you? Right? Make sense? See Deuteronomy 13 for that test. It's been 400 years. And at least according to the description, it might not be an uncharacteristic to call this man scraggly, right? A scruffy-looking man who lives out by the River Jordan. He lives a life of simplicity. I guess you could call it poverty. However, I'm not sure he viewed it that way in his context. I mean, people around might, but it was definitely not a life of, say, opulence. But he has his own thing, eating honey, locust, wore animal skins. But he talks about a man, a prophet greater than he who will come after him. But it's been 400 years since we've heard about this man, and he talks about the one following him, because it's not uncommon for a prophet to have another. That's when we get the story of the Messiah. Context. It's been 1,000 years since King David. Hundreds and hundreds of years of occupation. People now scattered. They're all over the globe. And there's just a remnant left in this land. And all of them, they have this particular way of viewing the Messiah of the prophets. They have expectations in their context. You have been told from the readers or the leaders of old. So in their context, occupied land, Rome is overarching, right? Religious leaders, they're trying to consolidate power. Maybe religious leaders really shouldn't be in the power business, but still, they're definitely living in a land of occupation and under oppression. And yeah, I agree, there is no respite in sight. So in context, it seems rather obvious that one would want or expect from a rescue, right, what you've been told to expect. Well, that's why we're hearing or reading the story that they are, because their expectation versus what comes. Context. And I guess in this little part, I just need to remember that within all of that context, right, we see the behavior of the Messiah very much in contrast to the context, right? His life, the way he lived, the way he talked, the way he expressed it in his life while he was here. It was not what we would expect of that rescue context, right? Service, Sermon on the Mount, confusing parables. Not only walk, but carry what is not yours, unbidden by you, unrequested by you, and oh, an extra mile. And for the oppressor, no less. We have Samaritans, we have healing, we have feeding, we have washing feet. So context. Now, we're 2,000 years later. Now we have a book compiled from scrolls, which are the collections of these stories, right? The storyteller's written words, passed down for thousands and thousands of years. And for some reason, since this really is a continuous single story, right? But we group this into two subgroups, commonly called the Old and New Testament, right? Discussion for another day. But every single one of those stories, as we talked about from the very beginning, they're not in a vacuum. Things are going on. They're not pretty. They're colorful. But they're not little flannel graph stories that you can tell the children, right? The vast majority, they're messy. They're ugly. They're uncomfortable. And I think one of the most humbling things is that if we picked up a mirror, I think we'd see things about ourselves again that make us very uncomfortable when we have to engage in these stories. But now we have this collection, this book. And then we take quotes out of it, snippets, cliff notes. We snip and clip like letters in a ransom note, right? A story we want to say. Maybe just read the notes that have been passed on down to us, but in that, maybe we're missing the opportunity to see the full story in the different light, taking it all in context. Think of the authors of the scrolls we read in this collection, right? We have the prophets that were living in a land, right, that God had judged, the things that God is asking them, the prophets, to do to show the people, to live in a way that, for them anyways, I would probably say, this might be a bold statement, but we are not comfortable living. The vast majority of us would want nothing to do with living our lives the way of a prophet. If God called us to be his spokesperson, but he said, I want you to do this, right? And then go glance at those particular prophets' lives, please. I think most of us would back out. To be honest, I would tell you, I would want, personally, none of it. But then we use the words inside these stories. And again, we take clips. We steal them. We misappropriate them. We place them in contexts that do not serve the original story in which they belong, in their context. I think we see this often when people align a verse or a section in this book or in that book, and they use it out of context to benefit themselves or benefit a cause. But in that, often to the discredit of the God who is at the center of this entire collection, in every context, who was about love, relationship, and reconnection. And I remember again, maybe I don't want to try so hard not to impose myself on the story of this God who wants a relationship with us. But I think I want to let the story impose itself upon me, to see them, to see ourselves, see how all of this, right, how all of this connects us to the God of creation and what he gave to us, his Son, our Messiah. But our context is now. We each come from different sets of circumstances. We come from different places. We come from different experiences. Remember that. Because I think it's really much easier then, if we do, to love somebody if we remember that. Because if we choose to intersect with God in our context and respect and have empathy for those before us and after us, and in their context with God, and then maybe we can allow those connected to this relational God to continue the story before us, through us, beyond us. And then the humbling part is with us being looked back upon. What might others see when they look back at us, like we look back at them? So thanks for with us tonight on another episode of Coffee and Donuts with Context, as we wrapped up this exploration, this little three-part thing, just to bring up, does context matter? I'll put it out there for Coffee and Donuts that it does on the Dusty Feet.